it's interesting how you came to this process of realizing for yourself first, then your patients, and then kind of getting a little angry. Yeah. Is that about right?
Yeah, and I'd actually been collecting these lies since I was an intern.
Oh.
But in residency, you don't question, you don't argue. You just write stuff down, memorize, and move on.
Right.
And so I can remember the very first thing that made me go, what? I was on my obstetrics rotation. I'm family practice, so we in Tennessee we're actually trained. We do C-sections and vaginal births and all that, and so we were on call the night before. The next morning we were discharging all the vaginal births, and the chief resident said, "Now don't forget to write vitamin D drop prescriptions for all the exclusively breastfed babies." And I'm like, "What? Why would I? Why? What's that mean?" He said, "Well, humans don't make vitamin D in their breast milk," and I'm like, there's no way that's true.
Yet somehow we survived to be here today.
For 250,000 years as a species, we've been here and we're not extinct. We didn't all die of rickets. That's exactly what went through my head. I'm like, what? And so I look at the attending physician over in the corner who's doing something, but he's nodding like, yep, that's right. I'm like, okay, obviously I don't understand something because that makes no sense. And so later when I did have time to research that, I didn't argue. I just went along, wrote the prescriptions. But later when I researched it, I had found that a doctor in the Carolinas had already done the study. And she found that when you put breastfeeding women on 6,400 international units of vitamin D3 a day, which is mimicking what we would have gotten thousands of years ago, being outside all day and doing what we do, women make vitamin D plenty for their baby. And so looking back, my chief resident was a very smart guy. Very intelligent, very well-read. My attending, obviously, was the attending at a teaching university for a reason. Very smart guy.
Right.
But they both had no idea. Not only they were wrong about that fact, but the underlying concept of how did we get here if that is in fact true.
Right.
And to me, that blew me away. Like I looked up to those guys and still do. They're very intelligent when it comes to certain things. But even just that basic premise, they missed the magnitude of that. Like, no, that's totally wrong.
It's a great example because they're not being malicious. They're not trying to hide something. They're not trying to promote an agenda. It's just who's got time to investigate every single recommendation. Right. Some things you have to take at face value, but it takes someone like you to question those.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the lies in the book that I talk about in multiple chapters in Lies My Doctor Told Me came from my journey back to good health and back to just being vigorous and vibrant and happy and eager to live my life instead of groaning and complaining when I get out of bed in the morning.
Right. Good point.
여기서 캔베리 박사의 말은 비타민 D를 보충할 필요가 없다는 뜻이 아닙니다. 대부분의 산모들은 비타민 D 결핍 상태이며 그것이 인간의 모유에서 비타민 D가 발견되지 않는 이유라는 것입니다. 그는 책에서 저지방 식품 섭취와 주로 실내에서 지내는 생활 방식이 현대인들의 비타민 D 결핍의 중요한 요인이라고 추정합니다. 캔베리 박사는 비타민 D가 인간의 신체 기능 전반에 걸쳐 매우 중요한 영양소임을 강조하며 대부분의 현대인들은 비타민 D가 부족한 상태라고 지적합니다. 따라서 그는 햇빛을 자주 쐬어 체내에서 자연적으로 비타민 D를 생성하는 것이 중요하다고 주장합니다. 또한 그는 보통 영양제보다는 자연적인 식품을 통한 영양소 섭취를 권장하지만 비타민 D만큼은 보충제를 통해서라도 충분히 섭취해야 한다고 강력히 권고합니다. 건강보험 심사평가원에서 진행한 한국인 영양결핍 현황 조사에 따르면 조사 대상의 73.7%가 비타민 D 결핍이었다고 합니다. 따라서 이 내용은 미국인들뿐만 아니라 우리들에게도 해당하는 내용입니다. 캔베리 박사의 책 의사의 거짓말에서는 이와 같은 사례를 많이 다루고 있으며 이어지는 인터뷰에서는 사람들이 흔히 오해하는 또 다른 중요한 식품에 대한 이야기가 나옵니다.
So there's a number of examples you have in your book, and one is whole grains, healthy whole grains, right? So this concept of healthy whole grains came by comparing whole grains to refined grains. No question, it's going to be better for you. But then it got blown into this concept of everybody needs healthy whole grains. So tell us a little bit about that lie.
Yeah, and so every medical concept that I kind of roll over in my mind, initially I'm all about the common sense. Does this make good common sense? Number two, does it make ancestral sense? Like the vitamin D thing. Really, how did we not become extinct from rickets, right?
Yeah.
We would have all had rickets if we didn't get our vitamin D drops because we were all breastfed.
Right.
And then the third one is any meaningful research and not just drug company-funded research, but meaningful research with large enough numbers that are blinded and controlled so you can actually glean useful information. And so I try to take those three things, common sense, ancestry, and the available research, and form an opinion about this. And so that's what I try to do with each and every lab. And so the whole grain thing, first of all, human beings have only eaten grains of any kind in any meaningful percentage for the last 10 to 12,000 years. And so we've been on this planet as a species for at least 200,000 years. And so anything that makes you more fit to reproduce and live, that's good, right? And so you were to think we would have discovered the grain thing tens and 20,000s of years ago if it was that big of a deal. And so I'm always suspicious of any new finding or discovery that flies in the face of our ancestry and just good old common sense.
Right.
And immediately that flies in the face of two of them, right? And then when you start to look at the actual, any meaningful research about grains or whole grains, it's ridiculous. There's nothing there. And so therefore, yeah, you don't need grains at all. Our ancestors, for 99.95% of our existence on this planet, maybe ate a grain every now and then by accident. They might have eaten a grass seed as they were picking up the meat off the ground, but they didn't go out of their way to look for grains or to try to grow grains. That's not what they did.
You know what's interesting is there's sort of new data or people trying to come up with new anthropological data say, no, we did have grains earlier than we thought. But even if you accept that as true, it's still a drop in the bucket in terms of the long-term evolution. And though then you apply it to modern day. Yeah. And the people we're talking about today are not the people we were in evolutionary time, who were active all day long, who were in the sun all day long, who never sat, who weren't eating at all-you-could-eat buffets and junk food and processed foods. So even removing all that and saying just modern day studies of whole grains, what do you find in your patients when they eat whole grains and how they do?
Every patient, without exception, their inflammation gets better, and that can be inflammation in their skin or their gut or their joints or their brain, their mental activity. The inflammation and the consequences of that inflammation get better when I tell my patients to remove all grains, even stone ground, organic, non-GMO whole grains.
Yeah.
They get better physically and mentally. And so then there you go, there's that confirmation of not only does it not make any common sense or ancestral sense, there's no real research to support it. And so if you come to me with some new thing like, oh, everybody needs this now, if you're going to try to override the common sense of the situation and the ancestral appropriateness of it, you better have some damn good research. I mean, some over-the-top research if you hope to cancel out the ancestral appropriateness and the common sense of the situation. Because that's why we do research.
So you mean not like a weak observational study with a hazard ratio of 1.1?
Exactly right. Yeah, you don't even come to me with that, because if you're going to tell me that what we've done for the last 200,000 years is dumb, you better have some over-the-top controlled research that proves that, or I'm not going to listen to you.
Yeah. How about dairy? What do you have to say about milk and dairy?
And so let me, as a method of full disclosure, let me tell you, I grew up being a milk baby. When I was playing football in high school, I used to drink a gallon of milk a day.
A gallon?
Yes, every day. And I thought that was really going to build my bones and muscles and make me a better ball player. And so don't think I've always hated dairy. That's not who I am. I grew up on milk, okay? And so you didn't leave my grandmother's house without having at least one glass of milk. That was, you would get a spanking. I mean, it was mandatory. You had to drink your milk. And so then the more I started to look at this, I'm like, wait a minute, we've only been ingesting dairy products like this for about 8,000 or 9,000 years. I mean, you know, of course we had it before, but once a human being was weaned from the breast, they drank water their entire life. That's it. That was it for 99.99% of our time on this planet. There you go. There's your ancestral appropriateness. We didn't do that. And then also another thing I like to bring into this is life always finds a way. We've heard that, right? And so if dairy were really that magical of a nutrition source, there would be some weasel or some varmint or some rodent or some bird that would have adapted its behavior to steal the milk of mammals. There would be some weasel that snuck into and suckled at the cow's teat in the middle of the night or something. It had some kind of anesthetic so the cow would know, just like mosquitoes suck blood because it's very nutritious for them.
Right.
There would be some other animal that did that, right? Because we know of animals that will sneak in and steal eggs,
Sure.
that'll actually confiscate other bird and put their eggs in that nest so that bird does all the work.
Right.
Very, very evolutionary smart. But there is no example of any other animal stealing the milk of mammals. It just doesn't happen. And so that's weird. Also, no mammal drinks the milk of another species of mammal. There is no example of that in biology.
Okay.
And a big part of my training was comparative anatomy and animal biology. And so that didn't happen. And that doesn't make sense. If it's such a great source of nutrition, some animal would have found a way to steal that nutrition because that's what animals do.
Yeah.
We try to get stuff the easiest way possible. But no animal ever did that. And so then with all that in the back of my head, I started looking at the research. There's none there. There's no meaningful research that trumps all those other things. And then we go back to how I live my life. If you're going to tell me this common sense thing is wrong, you better have some good data to back that up. That's very hard data that can't even be argued with. And nobody has that. And so I stopped drinking milk. And that's one of the biggest reasons that my chronic allergies and my chronic dandruff and that helped the reflux as well. All those things got better when I stopped any liquid dairy at all. And so the only dairy I'll even entertain now is whole full-fat cheese, real cheese, or butter, or ghee, maybe some heavy cream every now and then, but I just don't touch liquid milk because it's made for the species that made it. And I used to tell my patients, if you want to gain weight as quickly as possible, then you need to drink lots of cow's milk every day because that's why cows make their milk like they do because the calf has to gain about 1,200 pounds in a year. That's what they do. And so if you want to gain weight, and when I say weight, I mean fat,
right?
Drink lots of milk because that'll get it for you.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have noticed that their health improves and their weight loss quickly accelerates when they get the liquid milk,
But okay with the solid dairy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so my thinking with that is cheese because there's a microbe that's acted. And so the microbe ate all the sugar. That's what it was after.
Right.
And in the process, it actually bent the protein molecules. That's why cheese is solid, not a liquid. And so you've gotten rid of all the sugar, which I think is the main problem with milk. But then for many people, the proteins in milk, they're not species appropriate. They're made for cows or goats or whatever. And so when you bend those proteins, you potentially make them much less inflammatory to your system. So all you're left with is no sugar, all the fat, and then a modified protein because the microbe bent the protein to make cheese or to make kefir or to make yogurt. And I think that's why a lot of people find they can't include those things in their diet and they're not nearly as inflammatory or fat-provoking as just drinking milk.
Yeah. Two really good examples of your thought process, which I think is very helpful. And
저는 이것이 캔베리 박사가 시청자들에게 우유와 통곡물을 절대 먹지 말라는 의도로 한 발언은 아니라고 생각합니다. 그 식품에 대해 숨겨진 정보와 팩트를 바로 보자는 겁니다. 그래서 여기서는 그 주장의 옳고 그름에 대한 논의보다는 그런 결론에 이르게 된 캔베리 박사의 사고 과정을 더 집중해서 봐주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 통곡물과 우유는 우리의 식탁에 자주 오르내리는 식품입니다. 영원히 배제할 수도 없고 또 그럴 필요도 없습니다. 다만 여러분이 저탄수화물 식단을 하기로 결정하셨다면 통곡물과 우유는 그러한 식단에서 권장되는 식품은 아니라는 점을 기억하시기 바랍니다. 제가 이런 말씀을 드리는 이유는 키토식을 하기 위해서는 여러 음식들을 평생 끊어야 한다고 생각하는 분들이 많기 때문입니다. 그런 생각은 시작을 주저하게 할 만큼 심적으로 큰 부담을 줍니다. 하지만 빈도수와 먹는 양만 조절하면 키토 식단에서 금기시되는 음식을 먹더라도 그 피해를 최소화할 수 있습니다. 쉽게 말해서 매일 먹지 말고 가끔 드세요. 한 번에 왕창 먹지 말고 조금씩만 드세요. 그리고 이어지는 인터뷰는 캔베리 박사의 의사로서의 사명감과 인격을 잘 보여주는 내용이니 집중해서 시청해 주시기 바랍니다.
It's interesting how people would sort of react to that thought process because some people would say, oh, well, that's not based in science. Show me the study.
Right.
But your thought process is saying, show me the study to counteract the hundreds of thousands of years of evidence. And so how are people reacting to this? I mean, both from, sort of an accusatory standpoint almost versus a science standpoint. How are physicians and
I get the full spectrum of reactions as you probably do as well.
Yeah.
But if somebody's really sick, metabolically ill, very, very inflamed, and they feel bad, and they try this, then they feel better.
Right.
And I don't have to talk to them anymore. They're done. They're like, oh, okay, got it.
They're a believer.
And they do it. And so I have a lot of kickback from this subpopulation of young, healthy, lean 20-somethings who are in the trainer sphere or the nutritionist sphere, and they've never been obese. They've never been overweight or inflamed or sick. They've been blessed with good genetics, and they can eat whatever and feel great and look great. And that worked for me. I mean, when I was 22, I was this tall and weighed 185 or 190 pounds, had a six-pack without trying. I mean, I was just, I was a very lean guy.
Yeah.
And so if you had taken nutrition advice from me at that time, I didn't know anything about what I was talking about because whatever I did worked for me. And that's who I get the most kickback from is these young, healthy guys saying, no, it's all about calories, stupid. It's science. And it's like, yeah, you don't know because first of all, you're young. You're a young punk who's never had to even think about his diet. You could live on Doritos and Twinkies.
And you'd still look that way.
Look great and feel great. I used to be that same guy back in my 20s. And
Come
so I
talk
know
to me in 20
that's
years.
Exactly right. I know. I used to live your life. I know. I could be like, oh, no, you need to eat more honey buns. Look at me. Right? And they would have looked at me and went, well, he looks great. Maybe I should eat more honey buns. But these young guys don't know what they're talking about. And so that's where I get the biggest negative kickback. Most doctors are like, wait a minute, show me the science. And I flip that on them. And I say, no, you show me the science. Because what I'm talking about is evolutionarily appropriate, ancestrally appropriate. It makes common sense. So for you to trump that in your medical practice and recommend something that is contrary to what we've done for 99% of our time on this planet, sounds like it's you who should have the data, not me.
Yeah, great perspective, especially when you're in the context of a study that you just posted on social media recently that 40% of docs are overweight and 23% are obese. Now, if that's where your information is coming from without the data to back up what they're doing, there has to be a broader reawakening, and it's almost crazy that there hasn't been.
I totally agree. Yeah. And that's why I sometimes get a bit harsh on social media because I think that fat, unhealthy, miserable doctor, he needs somebody to get in his face and say, hey, dude, ultimately you're not just harming yourself. You're not just making your own family miserable with your miserable existence. You're actually harming people who are paying you to help them. And in my mind, that is the ultimate malpractice. Is if you're so mentally lazy, you're not even going to think about this. You're just going to repeat what the drug rep said, or you're going to repeat something you heard on CNN or Fox News last night. That's it. You're going to read the conclusions of medical studies, and that's how you're going to practice medicine. That's pretty crappy.
Yeah.
And and so I try to get in that guy's face and say, hey, what are you doing? And so I made a YouTube video. Why are there fat doctors? Explain that to me. Right. And so if you had a mechanic and you went to him and his car never started,
you'd stop going to him.
You wouldn't talk to him. You'd be like, okay, thanks, dude. I'm going to look elsewhere. If you had a cosmetologist or your hairdresser and their hair was ratchet, you would not go to them. And so why are you going to entrust your health and your one life to a fat, unhealthy, diabetic doctor?
Wow.
No.
Crazy perspective.
Don't do that.
Makes so much sense, right? But not something that we live with or think about.
Right. Yeah. But we have to. And it's not fair. And I tell patients this, it's not your fault, but it is your problem.
Yeah.
If you have I had patients, and we have a preeminent gastroenterologist in Nashville, and he tells every patient who has a flare-up of diverticulitis to avoid seeds and nuts. And that's his number one piece of advice, which you may know is completely meaningless advice. He's probably actually increasing the risk of having a flare-up of their diverticulitis because there was a huge, huge study done with 43,000 participants that shows without doubt what causes diverticulitis or flare-ups at least is being overweight, is eating processed foods, is smoking, is alcohol. It's all those things. It has nothing to do, you ate some strawberries and a seed got trapped in your diverticuli.
Somehow that's been passed down from generation to generation.
Even preeminent board-certified gastroenterologists tell people this message. And I've talked about that myth relentlessly for at least 7 years on social media, and it's still out there. I just talked to a lady who her gastroenterologist just told her husband, you got to stop the seeds and nuts because that's what's causing your diverticulitis, even though that is based on no research. Human beings have eaten nuts and seeds since before recorded history, but yet somehow now that's the cause of diverticulitis. And so, but that's the kind of doctor I'm trying to reach.
Right.
And I think we're having an effect. I think they're hearing this, and it's making them uncomfortable, which is good.
That was my next question.
기존에 가지고 있던 상식의 기준에서 보면 그의 생각이 편향된 것으로 비춰질 수 있습니다. 하지만 이 인터뷰를 보면 그가 정립한 인간에게 완전한 식단과 의사들이 들춰내기 싫은 부분을 지적한 그의 책 의사의 거짓말은 그가 당연하게 여겨지던 상식에 의문을 품고 진실에 다가가기 위한 독특한 접근 방식이 만들어낸 결과물이라는 것을 알 수 있습니다. 그는 이런 사고방식을 설파하며 300만이나 되는 구독자를 모았고 그의 메시지에 동의하고 따르는 사람들은 계속 늘어나고 있습니다. 그리고 이것은 제가 그를 좋아하는 이유이기도 합니다. 그는 책에서만 본 이론을 떠드는 방구석 전문가가 아닙니다. 그는 본인이 직접 실천하고 경험해보면서 알게 된 살아있는 지식을 전달하는 사람입니다. 그의 설명이 상당히 디테일하고 메시지에 자신감이 넘치는 이유는 이렇게 깊은 지식에 경험이 더해졌기 때문이라고 생각합니다.
We're talking about a lot of sort of the negative sides of things, but are you seeing the tide changing? Are you seeing that this movement is having an effect both for focusing on the quality of research and focusing on the low-carb movement that is now gaining so much steam? What are you seeing among your colleagues?
I think it's having an effect at all levels, which was actually my goal, because it's having a huge effect in the patient population because they're now awake. Like, oh, you're telling me that what I eat actually has a meaningful effect on my health and how I feel? Interesting. Let me look into this. Nurses and mid-level providers are really coming on board with this. And I've had numerous physician assistants and advanced practice nurses come to me as a patient and say, I believe in what you're doing, but my supervising physician won't allow me to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so then we discuss ninja level ways of getting this information to the patients without them getting in trouble with their supervising physician. I think currently what we're doing mainly with physicians is just making them very uncomfortable. Because, you know, physicians like to know what they're talking about. They like to know that they know. And there's no doubt about this. This is settled science. That's the term we hear a lot. And now we're throwing up in their face, no, dude, this is not settled science at all. You're practicing actually quite precarious medicine. You may be standing on a foundation of sand. You may be giving your patient bad advice. And if that makes a doctor uncomfortable, good.
Yeah.
Because doctors' jobs are to think and to read and to research and to read outside their field of specialty. You don't get to just do what the drug rep who came and brought the new samples to you. You don't get to, that's not, you don't get paid what you get paid, and you don't get the prestige of being a doctor if that's how you're going to practice medicine. You don't deserve it.
Interesting. A doctor's job is to think and to read, and I think if you asked most doctors that, they would not agree.
Exactly. Their job is to follow the standard of care.
Right.
And to practice EBM, which they think stands for evidence-based medicine, but which I propose stands for eminence-based medicine. And so whatever the guy with the longest white coat in the room says, that's what we're all going to do. That's asinine. I mean, you are literally harming your patients if you practice that kind of EBM, which I would posit is the most common kind of EBM practiced. And it's supposed to be evidence-based. Like, oh, we tell you this because it's based on all this research. But in reality, especially when you start talking about things like statins and the new medications for type 2 diabetes and all that kinds of stuff, there's no meaningful research that backs these drugs up, right?
Yeah.
Nobody looks at all-cause mortality if you're taking these drugs. They just look at, it lowered your A1C by 1/10 of a point. And they don't even compare it to the other drugs on the market. They just compare it to placebo.
Right.
So these studies are weak to start with, and then you're going to base your entire practice on that?
Yeah.
Come on.
Great perspective about the eminence-based medicine. There's just a study that came out in JAMA looking at the guidelines by the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, and how many of them are truly evidence-based. It was like 10% are actually based on high-quality evidence. The majority of them are consensus statement, but somehow a consensus statement becomes evidence-based medicine.
That's exactly right, yeah. And so if you get a bunch of old doctors in a room with long white coats and let them discuss something and come up with their opinion, somehow that's evidence? That's research? I don't think so.
여기서 캔베리 박사가 언급한 전체 사망률은 특정 약물이나 치료법이 전체적인 사망률에 미치는 영향을 평가할 때 사용되는 지표입니다. 즉, 어떤 약물이 특정 질병의 위험 수치를 낮추는 효과가 있더라도 그 약물이 환자의 전체 사망률을 줄이지 못한다면 그 약물은 실제로 건강에 도움이 된다고 평가할 수 없습니다. 예를 들어 캔베리 박사가 언급한 스타틴이란 약물은 고지혈증 환자들의 LDL 콜레스테롤을 낮추기 위해 흔히 처방되는 약물입니다. 실제로 그 약물은 확실히 LDL 수치를 낮추는 효과가 있습니다. 그러나 스타틴이 심혈관계 질환의 위험을 줄인다는 연구들은 대부분 그것을 만드는 제약회사에 의해 설계되고 수행된 것이기 때문에 그 신뢰성에 의문이 제기되고 있습니다. 더 나아가 스타틴이 전체 사망률을 유의미하게 줄이지 못한다는 신뢰할 만한 연구 결과들이 있으며 약물 사용에 따른 부작용 문제도 꾸준히 제기되고 있습니다. 대표적인 부작용으로는 혈당 상승, 인지기능 저하, 간기능 이상 등이 있습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 현실은 많은 의사들이 콜레스테롤 수치가 높은 환자들에게 부작용이나 환자 개개인의 건강 상태를 충분히 고려하지 않은 채 스타틴 처방을 너무 쉽게 결정하고 있습니다.
So when it comes to treating metabolic disease, when it comes to treating diabetes in your 20-year career, have you seen anything even remotely as effective as a low-carb diet?
Nothing ever. Nothing
Yeah.
ever. If you could